Hi there. Welcome to tonight's journey into the strange, the absurd, and the oddly comforting corners of the ancient world. You found your place by the fire, and the stories are ready to unfold. Tonight, we begin a slow drift into history. Not the grand stories of war or kings, but the quiet, curious laws that governed everyday life long, long ago. So lay back, let your body sink into comfort, and allow your mind to wander gently through forgotten times. No pressure to remember, no need to keep up. Just listen and rest. Imagine, if you will, that you're standing at the edge of an ancient city. The sun is setting behind sandstone walls. Market stalls are closing. Priests in linen robes pass silently. The smell of incense and dust fills the air. Life in ancient civilizations moved to rhythms we can barely imagine now. But beneath the rituals and the empires, there were rules. And not just any rules. Some of the strangest laws ever recorded. Before modern legal systems, laws were often dictated by kings, priests, omens, or even the weather. And the results? Frequently absurd, sometimes poetic, and occasionally downright hilarious. This is not the kind of history that appears in textbooks. It's the kind of history whispered from one generation to the next, the kind that makes you raise an eyebrow or stifle a sleepy chuckle. Take, for example, the ancient Mesopotamians. In Babylon around 4,000 years ago, under the famous Code of Hammurabi, if a builder constructed a house and that house collapsed and killed the owner's son, then the builder's son would be executed. Not the builder, his son. Why? Because ancient justice didn't operate by logic as we know it. It worked through symbolic balance. A son for a son, a life for a life, a poetic if brutal symmetry. But even that isn't the strangest part. There was also a law that said, if a woman enters a tavern or drinks wine, she shall be burned. This law likely applied to priestesses who were expected to live apart from common society. Still, quite the overreaction to a glass of red. And it gets better or worse, depending on how sleepy you are. In Assyria, laws regulated not just what people did, but how they appeared while doing it. There were laws specifying how a woman should veil herself in public, and more importantly, who was allowed to wear a veil. Prostitutes were not allowed to cover their heads. If they did, they could be flogged, tarred, and have their ears cut off, but noble women. Veiling was required. Going outside without a veil was considered dishonourable. One piece of cloth, two completely different meanings depending on your status. And then there were laws about dreams. Yes, dreams. In some parts of Sumer, dream interpretation was considered so important that only temple-appointed dream readers could legally explain what a dream meant. If a regular citizen tried to interpret someone else's dream, especially if that dream was thought to be divine, it could result in temple punishment. There was even a law that said, if a man tells a dream not his own, and he speaks falsely of it, he shall be whipped 10 times by the temple rod. Imagine being half asleep, describing your dream about flying goats or rivers that speak, and someone arrests you for getting the symbolism wrong. Welcome to ancient lore. As we move through the next parts of this story, we'll travel from the heat of Mesopotamia to the elegance of Egypt, through Greece and Rome, across medieval Europe, into imperial China, feudal Japan, and beyond. Each place had its own laws, many of them necessary, some of them wise, and some of them completely ridiculous. Like in ancient Greece, where cutting down a sacred olive tree could land you in exile for life. Or in medieval France, where snails were actually put on trial. empires, or in ancient China, where the emperor was the only person allowed to wear yellow. And if you dared break that rule, well, let's just say you wouldn't be wearing anything ever again. These laws may sound silly now, but they reveal deep truths. They show what people feared, what they valued, what they believed made the world fair. And they offer something else too. They offer a gentle kind of wonder, the kind that makes history feel close, like a story being told at the edge of sleep. So tonight, as you close your eyes, we begin this 10-part journey. You don't need to memorize the dates. You don't need to remember the names. Just let the images drift past. Let their strangeness wash over you. The fire is crackling. The stars are out. And strange laws await. Ready? Let's begin with Babylon. In the cradle of Mesopotamia, nestled between the ancient rivers Tigris and Euphrates, stood one of the world's earliest cities of law, Babylon. Beneath its sun-baked walls and soaring ziggurats, Babylonian society unfolded with order, hierarchy, and one of the most fascinating legal systems ever carved into stone. In the 18th century BCE, King Hammurabi ruled the Babylonian Empire and set forth to ensure that justice, as he saw it, would be preserved for generations. To do this, he issued a code, the Code of Hammurabi, engraved on a towering basalt stele more than 2 meters high. This monument was placed in public for all to see, though few could read its ancient Akkadian script. It wasn't just a legal text, it was a declaration of divine order. The laws, nearly 300 in number, governed every aspect of life: commerce, labour, marriage, property, punishment, and personal conduct. But among the laws, some harsh, some oddly specific, one particular method of judgment stood out, defying time and logic: trial by river. If someone was accused of a serious offence, say sorcery, betrayal, theft, or even perjury, but no witness could be found and no material evidence provided, the accused would be led to the Euphrates. There, before a gathering of community elders, temple officials, and curious onlookers, the accused would be cast into the river. If the person floated, swam ashore, or otherwise survived, they were declared innocent. If they sank and drowned, the gods had judged them guilty. Justice, in this case, came not from judges, but from the current. This practice may seem absurd by modern standards, yet in Babylon it was seen as impartial, even sacred. The river, after all, was a divine entity. The outcome was placed not in human hands, but in those of the gods themselves. This wasn't just legal judgment, it was theological ritual. Trial by river was not the only reflection of Babylonian justice's flair for drama. Take, for instance, the laws concerning construction. If a builder constructed a house for another man and the house collapsed, killing the owner, the builder was to be put to death. If the collapse killed the owner's son, then the builder's son was to die. This system of mirrored consequence, lex talionis, was the rule of the land. The famous eye for an eye law came from this very code. If a man destroyed the eye of another man, his own eye would be destroyed in turn. If he broke another man's bone, his own bone would be broken. These were not metaphors. These were mandates. However, punishment in Babylon wasn't equal across all classes. If a nobleman harmed another nobleman, the full punishment was carried out. But if the victim was of lower status, say a commoner or a slave, then a fine might replace physical retaliation. Justice was hierarchical. not blind. Medical professionals, too, lived under strict scrutiny. If a doctor performed surgery with a bronze knife and the patient died, the doctor's hands could be cut off. Yet, if the same operation was successful, the doctor might receive 10 shekels of silver, a significant fee. Surgeons were held accountable with terrifying stakes. Marital laws were deeply codified. A man could divorce his wife if she was barren or disobedient, though she would receive compensation. If a woman was caught in adultery, both she and her lover could be tied together and drowned, unless her husband chose to pardon her. Curiously, if a woman's innocence was in question, she too could be subjected to the river ordeal. Family dynamics were formalized. Children could be adopted with legal contracts, and disobedient sons could be disinherited or punished corporally under court approval. The father's authority was virtually absolute within the household. Commerce, too, was highly regulated. If a merchant loaned money, it had to be recorded. Interest rates were limited. If someone defaulted on the loan, land or goods could be seized, but debt slavery had time limits. Even ox rentals came with written contracts. If an ox died under a borrower's care due to negligence, compensation had to be made, usually in silver or another ox of equal value. One of the more fascinating occupations detailed in the code was that of the tavern keeper, almost always a woman. She was expected not only to serve ale, but to report any suspicious activity. If she allowed criminals or rebels to gather in her establishment without reporting them, she could be executed. Alehouses were not merely social centres. They were monitored extensions of the state. Inheritance was regulated as well. If a father died without a will, his sons divided the estate equally. If he had children with different wives, the code dictated who received what based on legitimacy, marriage contracts, and property origin. Even dowries had strict definitions, and disputes were handled in public courts. Religion permeated every layer of the code. The temple economy was protected by law. Theft from temple property or lying under oath to temple priests brought the harshest penalties. The gods' domains, land, livestock, offerings, were seen as sacred and untouchable. Even public infrastructure was regulated. If someone neglected a dike and it broke, flooding fields, the negligent party had to compensate the farmers. Agricultural responsibility was communal, and water management was sacred, an understandable concern in a river-dependent society. What stands out in all of this is the intensity with which Babylon tried to impose order through fear, structure, and spectacle. The stone stele itself was placed in a public square for visibility. Though only scribes and elites could read it, its presence alone was a warning. Law was not hidden in scrolls or temples. It stood tall in the open, its cuneiform ridges catching the desert sun, casting long shadows of consequence. Babylon's laws are both terrifying and fascinating. They show a civilization deeply concerned with balance, perhaps even obsessed with the idea of consequence. Whether through river judgment or eye for eye logic, Hammurabi's vision of justice was total, public, painful, and profoundly symbolic. As people walked the bustling streets of Babylon, traders, scribes, soldiers, and servants, they lived in the long shadow of those laws. And above them all, silent and immovable, stood that black pillar, watching, waiting, weighing. Travelling west from the lands of Babylon, The winds shift warmer, softer, brushing against golden dunes and temple stones kissed by the sun. Civilization continues along the Nile, where towering obelisks and pyramids rise like silent sentinels, watching over the people of ancient Egypt, a society as layered as the linen they wore, as precise as the hieroglyphs carved into their monuments. Egypt's laws, like its culture, were deeply intertwined with religion. Here the divine touched everything: the flooding of the river, the birth of a child, the position of the stars. And within this sacred system, one creature rose to a position of almost mythical importance. Not the falcon, not the crocodile, not even the mighty scarab. It was the cat. In ancient Egypt, cats were not simply pets. They were seen as protectors, divine messengers, and symbols of balance. Their elegant movements and mysterious demeanour connected them to the goddess Bastet, a deity of home, fertility, music, and feminine power. Bastet was usually depicted with the body of a woman and the head of a cat, often carrying a sistrum, a musical rattle, symbolising her connection to harmony. To harm a cat in Egypt was to offend the gods, and as a result, doing so could carry the ultimate punishment: death. This was not a poetic exaggeration. Accounts from historians like Diodorus Siculus tell of Egyptians erupting in fury if a cat was even accidentally injured. One story recounts how a Roman visiting Egypt ran over a cat with his chariot. Despite the Romans' diplomatic status, the crowd reportedly killed him on the spot. Even the pharaoh's guard dared not interfere. The law and belief were absolute. Cats were not owned in the way we understand today. They belonged to the divine. They roamed freely through homes, temples, and even palaces, regarded as protectors from rodents and snakes, but also as guardians of spiritual order. Their role in religious life was so prominent that temples often housed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of cats, and when one died, it was honoured with ceremony. Upon the death of a household cat, the family entered a period of mourning. Men and women shaved their eyebrows as a visible sign of grief. The cat was wrapped in linen, sometimes treated with precious oils, and mummified, prepared for the afterlife with the same reverence given to human relatives. Cat mummies have been found in great quantities in necropolises such as Bubastis and Saqqara. They were buried in decorated coffins, surrounded by offerings, milk, toys, even amulets to protect them in the next world. These sacred animals were also associated with Egypt's military and political strategy. During a famous siege of the city of Pelusium in 525 BCE, Persian forces allegedly used cats and other sacred animals as shields, knowing the Egyptians would refuse to attack for fear of harming the divine. The strategy worked. The Egyptians surrendered rather than defy their laws of reverence. But the reverence came with structure. Egypt had laws regulating the breeding, ownership, and export of cats. It was illegal to smuggle cats out of the country, and there are records of officials being dispatched to neighbouring regions to retrieve escaped felines. Cat theft, meanwhile, was considered not just a crime of property, but of blasphemy. Merchants who attempted to trade cats as goods could face heavy penalties. The animals were not commodities. They were living embodiments of the goddess Bastet. And because religion was inseparable from law in Egypt, violations carried both civic and spiritual consequences. Other animals held similar importance: crocodiles for Sobek, ibises for Thoth, bulls for Apis. But the cat's domestic presence made it unique. It lived among people, yet above them, untouchable and divine. Beyond cats, Egyptian law was both sophisticated and layered. Though fewer complete legal texts survive from Egypt than from Babylon, we know that court records were maintained, contracts written on papyrus, and judges, often temple priests, presided over disputes. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and appear in court. Slavery existed, but slaves had certain protections under law. Theft, adultery, and murder were punished according to severity, often through restitution or forced labour, but sometimes with death. Yet nothing evokes the uniqueness of Egyptian law more clearly than its treatment of cats. In a society where the afterlife was prepared for with more care than the present life, where pyramids were built for a single soul's journey, and where gods could take the form of animals, it is no surprise that the law mirrored belief in such literal ways. Imagine walking through an Egyptian village at twilight. The stone homes are warm from the day's sun. People gather on rooftops, watching the river, and weaving between their legs, along walls and across baskets of grain, are the cats. They are not fed scraps. They are offered fish. They are not shooed away. They are bowed to. Children are taught from a young age to respect them. Adults avert their eyes as they pass. And if one cat curls into the lap of a priest in the temple of Bastet, it is a blessing, a message, a sign. To harm one is to break not only the law, but the world's balance. This sacred logic extended beyond cats. The Egyptian mindset approached the universe as Mayat, a principle of harmony, balance, and cosmic order. Law, religion, and daily life all followed this invisible rhythm. When Ma'at was broken by crime, violence, or disrespect to the divine, it had to be corrected, whether by punishment, ritual, or atonement. The laws of Egypt were never just about rules. They were about relationship, between man and God, between the living and the dead, between creature and cosmos. And in that network of reverence and regulation, it was the soft-pawed, golden-eyed cat that watched, wandered, and reminded all who saw it, this world is sacred. Walk gently. Among the sun-soaked hills and marble temples of ancient Greece, law was no longer simply a command from a king or a voice from the gods. It was beginning to take on a new shape: reason, debate, civic duty. But for all their philosophy and logic, the Greeks still passed laws that seem strange, even laughable, through the lens of modern time. And few were stranger or more fiercely protected than the laws surrounding the olive tree. To understand this, one must step into the city-state of Athens, where democracy was being born, and the great minds of Plato and Aristotle had not yet reached their prime. Even before the classical age of rhetoric and republics, Athens held a sacred identity, a city chosen, blessed, and guarded by the goddess Athena. Legend tells of a contest between Athena and Poseidon, the god of the sea. Both deities offered a gift to the fledgling city. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, producing a spring of salt water. Useful perhaps, but not practical for daily life. Athena, in contrast, planted an olive tree, a symbol of peace, wisdom, and nourishment. The Athenians naturally chose Athena's gift, and so the city became Athens. The olive tree was not just a plant, it was a sacred emblem of divine favour. That single myth birthed a complex legal reality. By the time Athens had grown into a true polis, a city-state with councils, courts, and citizens, the olive tree had become protected by state law. Not all olive trees, but specific ones called moriae. These were sacred trees believed to be descendants of Athena's original gift, and they were quite literally the property of the state. To harm one was not just a minor offence, it was considered an act against the gods and the people. Cutting down a moria tree, or even damaging one, breaking off a branch, disturbing its roots, could lead to exile, loss of property, or even death, depending on the severity of the crime and the legal climate at the time. Each year, state-appointed inspectors were tasked with examining the sacred trees. Their health, their fruitfulness, and their protection were matters of public record. A dead tree was mourned. A missing tree sparked investigation. These trees weren't just watched, they were counted. Olive oil was a central part of Athenian life. It fueled lamps, moisturized skin, flavored food, honored the gods, and served as a base for perfumes and medicine. Olive wood was used in religious carving and tool making. The trees themselves took decades to mature and could live for centuries. An Athenian grove was not simply a collection of trees, it was an economic and spiritual anchor. So the law stepped in to protect it. Court records from the 5th century BCE show legal cases involving olive trees. In one such case, a man accused of illegally removing a sacred tree was sentenced to lose his land and face public disgrace. His neighbours testified. His fields were searched. In Athens, such disputes weren't simply about property. They were about piety, loyalty, and the health of the republic. Even private olive trees were sometimes protected under specific ordinances. Landowners could harvest and prune, but if their farming practices harmed the surrounding environment, especially shared groves, they might be fined or censured by local officials. Olive theft was also treated seriously. Stealing olives, especially from a moria tree, could lead to public whipping or exile. In some areas, if the value of the stolen olives surpassed a certain threshold, the thief could be stripped of citizenship rights. The laws didn't just stop at the trees. There were broader laws governing appearance, behaviour, and morality that reflected a Greek desire for order, especially in Athens. There were regulations about public nudity, about how women could appear in festivals, and about the number of mourners allowed in a funeral procession. In Sparta, another Greek city-state with a radically different culture, laws were even more peculiar. Men were forbidden from wearing excessive jewellery. Wealth was deliberately made invisible. Even the currency was made intentionally heavy and impractical. Large iron bars instead of silver coins to discourage hoarding. Yet, among all these strange edicts, it was Athens' relationship with the olive tree that carried the most lasting weight. It exemplified how myth and law intertwined, how religion seeped into policy, and how a society could build entire systems around symbols. A walk through Athenian countryside in the 5th century BCE would reveal rows of gnarled silver-leaf trees, their roots clinging to dry soil, their trunks twisted with time. A farmer passing by might stop and whisper a quiet blessing. A scribe might pause to sketch a particularly healthy tree in his scroll. Even a soldier returning from war might kneel at the base of a moria tree in thanks. To touch one was to invoke history. To harm one was to risk everything. It's easy to think of the Greeks as hyperlogical, the birthplace of philosophy and democracy. But this law reminds us that even the most reasoned societies are shaped by myth, story, and symbolism. Athena's tree was not just protected, it was believed in. Modern laws tend to separate religion and state. But in ancient Athens, they were braided like the wreaths of olive branches placed on the heads of Olympic victors. The sacred and the civic were one and the same. And so, while other civilizations protected gold, or grain, or honor, Athens protected a tree. A simple, living thing. A gift from a goddess. A pillar of its identity. Among the marble columns and cobbled roads of ancient Rome, law was not only a civic tool, it was an identity. Roman society prided itself on structure, on rank, on order imposed through rules. The 12 tables, inscribed in the 5th century BCE, laid the foundation for Roman civil law. But beyond these serious codes were laws so oddly specific, so tangled in appearances and class anxiety, that they reveal a side of Rome rarely carved into statues. Begin with the toga. The toga wasn't simply a garment, it was a legal uniform, a fabric-based declaration of status. Reserved for male Roman citizens, particularly those of voting or senatorial class, the toga was required attire for appearing in public forums, courts, and official ceremonies. A citizen attending a trial without a toga might be turned away or even penalized for disrespect. Togas were not convenient. They were heavy, restrictive, and took practice to wear correctly. The folds had to be precise. The drape had to signify dignity. A poorly arranged toga could suggest disorder, laziness, or lack of upbringing. In some eras, legislation was introduced to enforce proper wearing of the toga in public. To dishonor it was to dishonor the Republic itself. Clothing laws didn't end there. Rome had an entire class of statutes called sumptuary laws, rules that regulated how much you could spend on clothing, jewelry, food, and entertainment. These laws were not about economy. They were about morality and social control. One such law, the Lex Oppia, passed during wartime, forbade women from owning too much gold, wearing multicolored dresses, or riding in carriages within the city. Though later repealed, it sparked massive debate about women's freedom and societal decadence. In practice, the state was using fashion to fight perceived cultural decline. Perhaps nowhere were these laws more peculiar than in the Roman dining room. The Roman banquet, or convivium, was an art, a ritual, and occasionally a battlefield of excess. To curb this extravagance, multiple sumptuary laws were passed over centuries, attempting to limit the number of guests, courses, or ingredients used during a meal. Under the Lex Fania, and later the Lex Didia, the state declared that a host could not spend more than a specified amount on a single feast. No more than 3 courses, limited quantities of meat, no imported delicacies. Certain fish were banned. Ostrich eggs, too exotic. Flamingo tongue, forbidden. Naturally, these laws were ignored. Roman hosts became masters of legal evasion. Dishes were nested inside one another to appear as a single course. Meals were held just outside city limits, where certain laws didn't apply. Names of foods were changed to disguise ingredients. A dish called country goose might contain peacock. Enforcement varied wildly. Some magistrates raided banquets, counting dishes and weighing meats. Others were bribed. The more powerful the host, the more elaborate the loopholes. Even lettuce was once a topic of legal concern. A story survives of a man being publicly scolded for serving fresh lettuce before a main course, a supposed violation of dietary modesty. The absurdity of this moment captures the Roman struggle between pride and regulation, appetite and appearance. Laws extended beyond the plate. Perfume, furniture, and even tableware were regulated. A senator might own ivory inlaid couches, but a merchant. Not legally, Silk, imported from the East, was considered dangerously seductive and morally questionable. Some laws even attempted to ban men from wearing sheer silk garments on the grounds that they made them appear unmanly. One particularly humorous law from the time of Emperor Tiberius concerned the use of purple dye. This deep imperial shade, extracted painstakingly from Mediterranean mollusks, was so expensive and so tied to royalty that unauthorized use was banned. Only the emperor could wear an entirely purple toga. Senators were allowed a narrow purple stripe. Anyone else caught in full purple risked confiscation of property, public shaming, or even charges of treason. Yet again, clever tailoring found ways around the rules. Garments were dyed in near purple shades. Purple linings were used where they couldn't be seen. A black outer robe might hide a hint of a legal colour beneath. Even facial hair wasn't safe from the legal gaze. While not strictly codified in statute, during certain periods, especially under later emperors, expectations were placed on how a Roman man should present himself. Beards were sometimes considered a sign of Greek decadence. Clean-shaven faces symbolized Roman discipline. And although no man was jailed for growing a beard, deviations could affect one's career or public standing. Further, the theatre seating law, or lex roscia theatralis, segregated seating based on social class. Senators sat in the front rows, knights next, commoners behind. Women and slaves often stood. This wasn't custom, it was law, enforced by ushers who could remove offenders for sitting above their station. In some instances, trying to sit in the wrong row was treated as a civic insult, mocked in satire and punished in reality. And perhaps the most quietly influential law of all was one not written, but deeply practiced: the expectation that Roman citizens perform their identity through law itself. To be Roman was to live within a framework of constant regulation. From your hair to your sandals, from your dining habits to your daily speech, behaviour was shaped, directed, and signified through legal boundaries. Yet for all these controls, Rome was also a place of contradiction. The same empire that outlawed excess built marble baths the size of stadiums. The same senators who passed modesty laws commissioned golden goblets. The same generals who enforced discipline through feasts with entire rooms made of sugar and honey. The laws, then, were not always about obedience. They were about projection, a vision of order, even when reality overflowed with chaos. Walking through the forum, a Roman citizen would be surrounded by these contradictions: statues of virtue beside brothels, libraries beside gladiatorial arenas, temples beside taverns, and in the centre of it all, law, etched in stone, posted in bronze, whispered by scribes. It was everywhere, even in the folds of a toga, even in a head of lettuce. As Rome crumbled and gave way to the medieval kingdoms of Europe, the torch of law passed into new hands. In medieval England, power shifted between monarchs, the church, and feudal lords. Law was no longer just about civics or the gods. It became a matter of sin and salvation. And from that mingling of power and piety came some of the most curious laws in recorded history. Take, for instance, the matter of kissing on Sundays. In the 15th century, under the rising influence of puritanical thought, a law was enacted in parts of England, particularly among more religiously zealous communities, that banned public displays of affection on the Sabbath. The reasoning was simple. Sunday was the Lord's day, a day for worship, silence, and reflection. To engage in anything frivolous, let alone romantic, was to risk disrespect. Thus, kissing your spouse in public on a Sunday could, in some towns, lead to public reprimand, a fine, or more often a stern warning from the local priest. If repeated, such offences could earn harsher punishments, a penance, public confession, or even being barred from church services. No small matter in a society where salvation was everything. The law wasn't just about affection, it was about control over behaviour, about reminding people that their bodies, even their mouths, were subject to higher authority. And kissing wasn't the only thing banned. Playing games, singing secular songs, dancing, or baking sweet pies on Sundays were all viewed with suspicion. The church kept lists of such offences, and town watchmen patrolled to enforce them. One town reportedly had a Sabbath bell rung at dawn, at which point all games, trade, and laughter were to cease. A kiss behind the bakery might bring a knock on your door by evening. The deeper strangeness of the period lies in its attempt to legislate not just actions, but intentions. Laws were passed against idleness, against thinking lustful thoughts, against excessive smiling in church. People were fined for arriving late to sermons. A man was once brought before the court for whistling while ploughing on a Sunday. Too cheerful, said the clerk. He was disturbing the holy silence. Meanwhile, across rural England, another curious law bloomed, the ale-tasting law. To ensure public health and fair trade, each village was required to appoint an official ale-taster, a man sworn to sample every batch of ale brewed in the parish. This might sound like a dream job, but it was serious business. If ale was too weak, or too strong, too sour, or improperly taxed, the brewer could face fines or lose their license. Ale tasters wore official badges and were expected to keep records of all inspections. The law existed not only to protect taste, but to preserve morality. Drunkenness was a sin, and poorly made ale encouraged both drunkenness and sickness. In some towns, ale tasting became ritualized. The taster would walk the streets, sampling mugs, trailed by children and town elders. A bad brew could be poured into the street as a warning, but not all strange laws were so ceremonial. Consider the curfew law, instituted as early as the 11th century. Curfew, literally from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, require all households to extinguish open flames by a specific time each evening, often when a bell rang. Originally intended to prevent fires in tightly packed wooden towns, the law evolved into a form of nighttime control. In some towns, repeat offenders were punished with the pillory loaf, a massive, purposely heavy loaf made to be tied around the baker's neck while standing in public stocks. The spectacle was humiliating and instructional. Bake fairly or be made a fool. One baker, legend tells, gave 13 loaves for the price of 12 to avoid the risk of underweight bread. This is believed to be the origin of the baker's dozen. Even animals were not spared the reach of strange law. There are documented cases of pigs being tried for murder, dressed in human clothing, and brought before a magistrate. If found guilty of causing human death, accidental or not, the pig was executed, sometimes even hanged in the town square. The logic was grim but clear. Order had to be restored. Even beasts were part of the moral fabric. Perhaps most telling was the law regarding women and mirrors. In certain religiously strict parishes, women were forbidden from owning more than one mirror, based on the belief that vanity led to sin. A woman with mirrored box or compact could be accused of narcissism, and some were fined for excessive self-regard. As odd as these laws sound, they reflect a world consumed by anxiety about sin, fire, disease, chaos, temptation. Law was how society pushed back against the invisible, the devil, the plague, the unpredictable heart. It wasn't just about keeping peace, it was about keeping order in the eyes of God. And so, to kiss on Sunday was not just affection, it was rebellion. To smile too widely was to stray. To serve sour ale was to threaten health and virtue. Every action had weight. Every moment was watched. In such a world, even silence had to be legal. Even joy had to be contained. Beyond deserts and oceans, far from the Roman roads and Gothic cathedrals of the West, stretched the vast and intricate tapestry of imperial China. A civilization built not just on walls and dynasties, but on harmony, hierarchy, and the constant dance between seen and unseen. Here, law was not merely punishment or protection. It was philosophy in motion. To live in imperial China was to live within a web of unwritten expectations, enforced as much by tradition as by statute. And when laws were written, they often revealed a world where symbolism outweighed logic, where control extended beyond actions into the very texture of life. How you dressed, how you bowed, even how loudly you breathed. Take, for example, the imperial law surrounding the colour yellow. During the Tang and Ming dynasties, wearing the colour yellow, particularly bright or golden yellow, was reserved exclusively for the emperor and his household. It was more than a fashion rule. It was a legal boundary of identity. Yellow symbolized the center of the universe, the earth itself, and the mandate of heaven. For a commoner to wear, it was not just disrespectful, it was treason. Tailors were forbidden from selling yellow-dyed robes to non-nobles. Dye merchants were inspected. Even owning yellow silk could draw suspicion. In one recorded case, a scholar received a gift of golden robes from a local governor. Though he never wore them, he was arrested for intent to impersonate royalty and spent 10 years in exile for a crime of colour. Similar control extended to names and words. During various dynasties, it was illegal to speak or write the emperor's given name aloud, even in casual conversation. Entire texts were rewritten to avoid characters that matched the sovereign's name. Calligraphers who accidentally left a royal name unaltered could be punished severely. This practice, known as naming taboo, created a linguistic culture where silence became safety. One of the most fascinating and bizarre examples of symbolic law came during the Qing dynasty, when a rule was enacted requiring citizens in some provinces to bow to the emperor's portrait every morning, even if they lived hundreds of miles from the palace. Scrolls bearing his image were distributed to officials and landowners, and failure to properly greet the emperor's likeness at a specific angle with regulated gestures could result in public correction or worse. The obsession with hierarchy didn't stop at portraits or colours. There were height laws too, unwritten but enforced. Servants were encouraged to stoop in the presence of nobility. A tall commoner might be ordered to bow or even wear flat shoes in court. During the Song dynasty, there are accounts of imperial guards selecting lower-ranking courtiers based on how diminutive they appeared next to their superiors. To stand too tall in a palace was to cast too long a shadow, metaphorically and politically. Speaking of shadows, A peculiar law in the later Ming period involved shadow puppetry, while the art of Pai Ying Shi, shadow theatre, was cherished among the people. It became the subject of censorship due to its subtle critiques of power. Performers who used animal shapes resembling emperors or officials could be accused of subversion. In one instance, a performance featuring a fox tyrant ruling over a village was shut down when a magistrate interpreted the fox as a veiled reference to a local tax lord. The puppeteer was beaten and banned from performing again. And then there was the silence law. In certain imperial provinces, especially near royal tombs or sacred temples, speaking above a whisper was not just frowned upon, it was legally restricted. Signs were erected, guards posted, and violators could be fined or whipped for disturbing the sacred quiet. Children were taught from birth to tread lightly and speak softly, especially near ancestral halls. In some areas of Beijing, early morning vendors were required to muffle their calls with cloth so as not to disturb the palace walls. The city may have bustled with trade, but within a few hundred meters of the emperor's sleeping quarters, stillness was the law. Even furniture was regulated. Certain chair designs, specifically those with dragon carvings, were banned outside of imperial use. A wealthy merchant who commissioned such a chair for his sitting room had his home seized and was paraded through town, seated ironically on the forbidden chair before it was burned in public. This obsession with symbolism extended into agriculture. During the Tang dynasty, rice fields near imperial palaces were not allowed to be tilled during certain weeks of the year, based on astrological readings. To disobey the stars was to risk bringing imbalance to the emperor's fortune. Farmers complied, even at the cost of their harvests. Another peculiar rule dictated that no dogs were to bark near the Forbidden City after sunset. Kennel masters employed by the palace were tasked with feeding, training, and even soothing local strays. Disobedient dogs were removed. Local households paid fines if their pets howled during imperial ceremonies. To many outside observers, such laws seem ridiculous. Micromanagement elevated to legal doctrine. But within China's Confucian framework, they made a certain kind of sense. The world, in Confucian thinking, is carefully constructed order, where each person has their place, each gesture its meaning, and each tone its correctness. Law wasn't just about crime, it was about disharmony, about ripples in the moral pond. A man who laughed too loudly during mourning could bring shame to his ancestors. A child who ran indoors could disturb the energy of the house. There were even laws about crying. During certain dynasties, family members of the deceased were required to wail publicly at specified times. Not crying was seen as a sign of disrespect and was punishable by law. Professional mourners were sometimes hired to meet this obligation, ensuring legal compliance through orchestrated grief. Yet perhaps the most curious aspect of Chinese law was its silence. Compared to Roman law's volumes and Babylon's codes carved in stone, China's legal tradition often operated through precedent, etiquette, and moral shame. The legalist traditions of earlier centuries, harsh and unforgiving, gave way in many regions to Confucian gentleness. But when rules were broken, punishments could be swift, symbolic, and spectacular. To walk through a Chinese village in the Ming era was to move through a living script, where banners spoke law, silence held weight, and even a colour could carry consequence. Order was everything. stillness was law, and in the hush between lanterns and incense smoke, the shadows whispered their own quiet rules. High in the valleys of central Mexico, surrounded by towering mountains and sacred lakes, the Aztec Empire built a civilization as complex as any in the Old World. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, rose from the waters like a vision, a city of floating gardens, causeways, temples, and gold. But behind its majesty was a world bound by laws so elaborate, so interwoven with ritual and divinity, that even something as sweet as chocolate was subject to rules of power. Among the Aztecs, cacao beans were more than a treat. They were currency, used to pay taxes, purchase goods, and even settle disputes. A handful of cacao might buy you a rabbit. 100 could earn a night in a good inn. But cacao was also sacred. The beans were believed to be a gift from Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, and consuming cacao in drink form was reserved for the elite, warriors, priests, and nobility. There were laws that forbade commoners from drinking cacao in public. A farmer caught sipping chocolate might be accused of pretending to be noble, a crime punishable by fines or public labour. Merchants and artisans, unless given special permission or acting in service of the state, were expected to consume simpler fare. Even the preparation of the drink was regulated. Chocolate was mixed with spices, chili, maize, or honey, but certain recipes could only be used during religious ceremonies. To misuse them was to offend the gods. In some temples, cacao was sprinkled into sacrificial fires or poured into the mouths of statues during offerings. But the laws of the Aztecs went far beyond food. They were obsessed with appearances, and that included teeth. Among the nobility, dental decoration was a sign of refinement. Jade, turquoise, and even gold were inlaid into the front teeth of high-ranking men and women. The process was painful and required skilled artisans, but not everyone could participate. There were laws that restricted dental inlays to the noble class. A commoner who adorned their teeth might be accused of impersonation, a serious offence. Punishments ranged from having the inlays removed with force to enslavement. The message was clear. Beauty was a marker of rank, and to violate that boundary was to challenge the cosmic order. Cosmic order was not just a concept, it was law. Aztec society operated under a strict legal code known as the Huehuetlatoli, or the Ancient Word. These laws, passed down orally and eventually recorded by Spanish chroniclers, covered everything from land disputes to adultery to clothing regulations. They were enforced by judicial tribunals, which existed even in small villages. Some were mobile courts, travelling from region to region, dispensing judgment with shocking efficiency. And justice was not blind. In Aztec law, punishment was highly visible. A thief might be beaten publicly or have part of their hair shaved in shame. A liar could be forced to clean the city streets while confessing their crime aloud. For serious offences, like drunkenness, the consequences were harsher still, especially for the young. The Aztecs believed in strict moral education, especially for boys and girls entering maturity. Schools were divided by class. Noble children went to Calmacac, where they learned astronomy, history, and military strategy. Commoners attended Telpochcali, focused on discipline and labour. But no matter the school, the rules were the same. No drinking, no laziness, no disobedience. A teenager caught drinking alcohol might be punished with death on the second offence. Parents could even turn in their children, requesting the court to discipline them. The punishment might include beatings, binding, or forced fasting under priestly supervision. Clothing was also tightly regulated. Nobles wore elaborate capes and feathers, especially the coveted quetzal plumes, whose green shimmer was reserved for the highest lords. A commoner caught wearing noble attire could be executed for stepping above their station. But these laws weren't just tools of oppression. In many ways, they acted as anchors of fairness. The Aztecs had a legal principle akin to innocent until proven guilty. Trials required witnesses, and some courts allowed for appeals. Judges were trained, respected, and often held their position for life. Corruption was rare, and when discovered, was punished severely. A corrupt judge could face death or dishonor, his name erased from records. Even slavery was legally defined in ways that may surprise modern ears. Slavery in Aztec society was not based on race, and it wasn't always permanent. A person could become a slave through debt or as punishment for certain crimes. But slaves had rights. They could own property, marry, and even buy back their freedom. Abusing a slave was punishable, especially if done by a master. If a slave fled and reached the royal palace or a market square without being caught, they could demand legal freedom under the protection of the gods. Religious laws, meanwhile, governed the calendar itself. Aztec priests maintained complex astronomical charts, which dictated not only ceremonies, but everyday behavior. Certain days were considered inauspicious: no farming, no weddings, no travel. To disobey the stars was to risk cosmic imbalance. Perhaps the most unsettling laws involved human sacrifice. The Aztecs believed that the sun needed nourishment to rise, and that nourishment was human blood. Prisoners of war were often used, but at times volunteers from within Aztec society were chosen, men and women honored as temporary embodiments of gods, treated luxuriously before being led to ritual death. But even this, strange as it may sound, was governed by rules. Only specific individuals could conduct sacrifices. The rituals had to occur on precise days, using exact tools and chants. A mistake in the ceremony could bring curses on the community. In one recorded incident, a priest who mispronounced a sacred word during a rite was banished for life, and the temple was closed for cleansing. Every action, every breath, was part of a larger pattern. The Aztecs saw law not as something imposed by man, but as echoes of divine order. To walk through the markets of Tenochtitlan was to move within a coded world. Colors, smells, sounds and gestures, all carrying meaning, all potentially subject to scrutiny. You might pause before eating a tamale, not because you feared indigestion, but because it might be the wrong day, under the wrong sign, invoking the wrong spirit. The Aztecs lived with a kind of legal intimacy that few civilizations could match. Law was not distant, it was close, woven into your clothes, your food, your family. In the shadow of the pyramids, beneath the soaring cries of temple flutes, every heartbeat answered to a higher rhythm. Even chocolate had its place. Even a gold tooth could be a crime. Even silence could speak of justice. In the sunlit corridors of Versailles, where mirrors stretched into eternity and perfume hung thick in the air, France in the 17th and 18th centuries wove its laws as delicately as it did lace. Under kings who considered themselves chosen by God, especially Louis XIV, the Sun King, law became an extension of image. Justice no longer wore armor, it wore powdered wigs, silk gloves, and a carefully measured smile. Among the most iconic symbols of the era was the wig. The bigger, whiter, and fluffier, the better. But the powdered wig was more than a fashion choice. It was, quite literally, a legal identity. Royal edicts dictated who could wear which kind of wig. The most extravagant styles, complete with cascading curls and sky-high structures, were reserved for nobility and courtiers. Judges had their own model, solemn, rectangular, and solemn in tone. Lower-ranking officials were assigned smaller, less dramatic versions. If a commoner dared wear a noble-style wig, they could be fined, questioned, or even accused of impersonation. Some records tell of a merchant's son who wore a wig too grand to a garden party and was briefly imprisoned for misleading the eye of rank. He emerged with a humbler hairpiece and a stronger appreciation for powdered hierarchy. But wig laws were just one curl on the powdered head of French regulation. During the height of Louis XIV's reign, laws were passed to control the length of one's sword, a literal measure of status. Nobles could carry swords of a certain length, merchants a shorter blade. The punishment for violating sword-length laws: confiscation, a fine, or in rare cases, public ridicule, which in aristocratic France could be worse than imprisonment. The obsession with appearance bled into food and nature as well. In one of the more unexpected corners of French law lies a long bureaucratic saga involving snails. France has always had a peculiar culinary love for escargot, but not all snails were created equal or legal. In 18th century Burgundy, two families feuded for decades over land rights related to snail harvesting. Because escargot was considered a gastronomic resource, its gathering was subject to regulation. Eventually, a royal decree defined which types of snails could be gathered, in what seasons, and by whom. Harvesting snails without a permit, or worse, gathering them during mating season, became a criminal offence. In one documented case, a man was sentenced to 3 days in jail for unauthorised escargot extraction. Local gossip claimed the snails were underage, but food laws weren't all jokes. The French courts regulated butter content in croissants, milk purity, and even the curvature of baguettes. Bakers were required to follow weight and shape standards, and deviation, especially during times of famine, could lead to public shaming or revocation of business licenses. And then there was the curious case of mirror laws. At a time when mirrors were a luxury, the French crown established a mirror-making monopoly, placing production in the hands of select guilds closely tied to the court. The famous Hall of Mirrors in Versailles wasn't just architectural grandeur, it was political theatre. To own too many mirrors, or to sell one outside guild approval, was to commit a trade crime. One noblewoman reportedly commissioned a mirror-covered boudoir. When inspectors discovered its illegal origin, glass from Italy smuggled through Marseille, the entire room was dismantled. She was allowed to keep one mirror, the one she used to apply rouge, under supervision. Speaking of cosmetics, they too were policed. During the 1700s, the law of appearances took root, an informal set of rules, codified through court decorum, that dictated how one must present oneself in proximity to royalty. Failing to powder one's face, or using the wrong shade of rouge, could bar one from Versailles gatherings. Perfume had to be floral, not musky. Shoes had to be embroidered, not buckled, depending on one's title. Even posture was legally examined. In royal court, to turn your back on the king, even by accident, could result in banishment. One duke famously tripped and turned as he fell, landing face up with his shoes pointing toward the throne. It was seen as an insult. He was forbidden from court for 6 months, until he wrote a poem of apology comparing the king's gaze to sunlight that melted his legs. Etiquette laws didn't end at the gates of Versailles. Chimney sweeping, window cleaning, and even urination in the streets, a serious urban issue, were regulated with specific timing laws. In Paris, chamber pot disposal had to occur before sunrise. Throwing it later, without shouting "Garde à l'eau," could result in a fine or a day in jail. That phrase, by the way, is the root of the English "look out below." But not all laws were ridiculous in form. Some were ridiculous in execution. Consider the trial of a dressmaker's scissors. In the late 1760s, a seamstress was accused of stealing fabric. The scissors she used were brought to court as evidence. However, since the scissors could not speak for themselves, obviously, the court demanded that a guild representative testify on their behalf, measuring them, weighing them, and reading into the moral character of their steel. After 2 days of testimony and the summoning of a blacksmith, the scissors were declared neutral and the seamstress acquitted. The lesson? In France, even objects could stand trial, and yet, beneath the powdered absurdity and legal comedy, there was an undeniable logic, however twisted. The French believed deeply in symbolism. Law was not just justice, it was a performance. Just as the ballet had steps, society had movements. You followed them, or you fell. To live in pre-revolutionary France was to know that a ribbon too wide, a hat too tall, or a laugh too loud could land you in trouble. Not necessarily with the law, but with the performance of law. And sometimes that was worse. Because in a world where appearances were everything, even silence had style. Even a crime had choreography. In the land of golden sands and black soil, where the Nile carved a green ribbon through the desert, the ancient Egyptians built one of the most enduring civilizations in human history. Their laws, like their pyramids, were constructed to last. Yet for all their wisdom, geometry, and spiritual depth, ancient Egyptian law held moments of baffling brilliance and sheer absurdity. At the heart of Egyptian life was Mayat, the concept of balance, truth, and cosmic order. Pharaohs ruled not just as kings, but as divine custodians of Maat. To break the law wasn't simply a civic failure, it was a spiritual one. And in that deeply sacred context, laws were passed that, to modern ears, sound as if they were written by dreamers, or perhaps comedians. Let us begin with the cats. To the ancient Egyptians, cats were holy. They were companions of the goddess Bastet, guardians of the home, and protectors from evil spirits, rats, and snakes. Killing a cat, intentionally or even by accident, was considered a crime against the gods, and it was punishable by death. Greek historians, including Herodotus, documented cases in which a person who killed a cat, even by accident, was lynched by angry crowds, regardless of their status or wealth. In one case, a Roman diplomat's chariot reportedly struck a temple cat. The man was dragged from his home and stoned, despite desperate appeals from Pharaoh's own messengers to spare him for the sake of foreign relations. So sacred were cats that when a family cat died, it was mummified and buried in a miniature sarcophagus. Grieving family members shaved off their eyebrows as a sign of mourning. Imagine the entire city of Thebes walking around with smooth brows and solemn faces, mourning not kings, but cats. Cats were not to be bought or sold. They were to be gifted, often by the temple. To attempt to export a cat out of Egypt was a serious smuggling crime. In fact, some pharaohs sent troops abroad just to retrieve runaway or stolen cats. But cats were just the beginning. In a strange corner of Egyptian law, there was a rule surrounding fish, specifically the oxyrhynchus, or sharp-snouted fish. In some regions, this fish was sacred, in others it was taboo, and that contradiction led to absurd consequences. In the city of Ombos, it was illegal to eat oxyrhynchus fish. The penalty? A fine or a fast of 7 days in honour of offended gods. But in Dendera, the same fish was served as a delicacy during temple feasts. 2 towns, same fish, completely opposing laws. Legend has it that once, a priest from Dendera travelled to Ombos and, unaware of local taboos, offered oxyrhynchus at a banquet. The result? Outrage. The priest was stripped of his robe, paraded through the market in shame, and forced to donate 20 amphorae of date wine to the local temple as penance. The fish incident became so infamous that, for years, travelling officials brought their own food, just to be safe. The law didn't just regulate diet, it extended to dreams. Yes, dreams. Egyptians believed dreams were messages from the gods, or omens from the spirit world. As such, dream interpretation became a legal matter in certain courts. Dream scribes were assigned to temples and high-ranking officials. But here's the catch. It was illegal for a commoner to publish or teach dream interpretation without temple approval. One scribe in Memphis was arrested for writing a dreamer's manual that included unapproved meanings. He had suggested, for instance, that dreaming of a white ibis signalled pregnancy. The Temple of Thoth, guardian of the ibis and writing, was deeply offended. His book was burned, and he was banished to a crocodile farm, not to be eaten, but to copy scrolls in isolation for 10 years. Speaking of crocodiles, they were often worshipped in the form of Sobek, a fierce river god. In some regions, killing a crocodile was punishable by death, while in others, where Sobek was feared more than adored, it was required that you kill any crocodile that approached the fields. One travelling merchant, it said, passed through both kinds of territory in the same week. In one village, he was praised for slaying a croc with a spear. In the next, he was fined 5 gold rings and forced to build a small shrine to Sobek. A lesson in the perils of geography and the gods. Another strange law from the time of Ramses II involved naming children. Parents were required to choose names from an approved list of deities, virtues, or natural symbols. A child named after a foreign word or non-Egyptian idea could be refused temple blessings. Names like Pebek, meaning lotus flower, or Kaimwaset, meaning he who appears in Thebes, were encouraged. But an attempt to name a child after a foreign conqueror, say Alexander, was punishable by exile or property seizure. Even laughter had its boundaries. In courtrooms or sacred temples, it was forbidden to laugh out loud. Smiling was permitted, even encouraged, especially during harvest festivals. But to laugh during a funeral, or while within sight of a sacred relic, was considered a mockery of the gods. One farmer, overcome by nervous laughter during a funeral rite, was made to fast for 3 days and publicly apologize to the community and the dead. And then there was mummification law. Mummification was a sacred science, reserved for specialists called embalmers, but not everyone could afford the full ritual. There were tiers: basic, intermediate, and royal. Still, the government imposed a luxury tax on gold wrappings, rare resins, or imported linens. Attempting to fake a royal-style mummy for a commoner using contraband gold foil or spices could result in a ban from burial grounds. One scandal involved a wealthy merchant who bribed an embalmer to use pharaoh-grade oil on his body. When discovered, his tomb was opened, his mummy downgraded, and the embalmer sent to clean temple floors for a year. Even in death, status was regulated. But perhaps the most quietly beautiful law in ancient Egypt was the law of truthful silence. Scribes were told, "Write only what is needed and what is right." There were legal restrictions on exaggeration, especially in official documents. A builder claiming his wall stood higher than Ra's chariot could be fined for blasphemy and dishonesty. Simplicity and clarity were considered sacred virtues, because in the world of the Nile, the most enduring things were those spoken softly, carved clearly, and weighed with balance. And so, in this land of tombs and temples, where cats were gods and dreams were evidence, where laughter was measured and fish could cause wars, we come to the end of our journey through the most ridiculous, remarkable, and revealing laws of ancient civilization. Not all laws were just, not all laws were wise, but every one of them, strange as they seem now, whispered something eternal about the human need for order, meaning, and control. Even if that meant protecting a fish or bowing to a cat.